So I'm going to hand the floor to Tristan Mattelart, professor at the French Presse Institut in Paris 2 University, researcher at the Interdisciplinary Research Unit for Media, CARISM, and so this is another ism, along with all the other isms: racism, Marxism, charism. So one of the specializations is the relationship between media and migration. He's published a number of papers on this issue, media, migration, and national culture. This was published in 2007 by De Burk. A number of publications and reviews, in particular a special publication on the theme of cultural diversity policies in Europe. So with that, I want to hand over to his review of diversity policies in France. Thank you, Christine, for this introduction. I'm delighted to be back here in Brittany to look at this issue of diversity. I don't use these isms, but I do say you should avoid the word diversity as well. This is a weasel word. It has multiple meanings, and it is so polysemic with so many meanings that it actually ends up concealing some of the aims put forward by so-called diversity policies. And the problem is that we cannot do without diversity today. Major policies with decisive issues at stake are implemented invoking diversity. So these policies need to be investigated and their aims deconstructed, going beyond the mere term of diversity. And to do that, the best way is to look at things over the long term. In other words, not just looking at a policy as some sort of freak, spontaneous phenomenon at the end of the 1990s, but in fact forming a continuity. And that is what I will attempt to demonstrate here. So one of the founding stones of this policy at a time when the word diversity was not in use, there was not such a thing as a diversity policy in name, but the story then goes back to the 1970s with the first form of this policy. We could go back further, but we don't have that much time. So if we look at the 1970s, at that time, there were programs called specific programs destined for people groups from immigration, or immigrant populations was the terminology that was used at the time. So this was a key program which was called Mosaic. Here it is on the screen. This program was disseminated in the languages of major immigrant population languages. It included information, practical information, entertainment with local artists who were invited to be involved. This program was on FR3, one of the national French TV channels. It was the most recent of the French public service broadcasters, and it was the most fragile channel, and that needs to be emphasized. So this program was inherently contradictory, because on the one hand, it would engage the interest of the immigrant audiences. You could see this from audience ratings. Began in 1976, and in 1978, it was 45% viewers, 45% of all immigrants watched this program, which is a huge penetration. And for them, it was important because, as Angéline Escafré-Dublé said, it broke a kind of cultural isolation in which these people groups were suffering. But the contradiction is that at the same time, this program was designed as a policy instrument to support and manage, in other words, combat immigration. The background was that of the first oil crisis, 1973, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing's fight against immigration and even return of immigrants to their home countries. So the link was that in these programs, there was cultural content from their own country of origin, basically to fuel nostalgia for their home country and make them want to go back home again. So that is the beginnings of so-called diversity policies. So there were other programs of this type, but Mosaic was the big one. Apart from these immigrant-specific TV programs, there wasn't really much awareness, much attention in public television of any need to address specific expectations on the part of viewers, and the lack of awareness was clear in a report, because a number of reports were published on this issue. There was a report in 1979 which dealt with the broader subject of culture and immigration. And in this report, it says that in the host country, immigrants are crushed by the media culture, and access of immigrants to host countries will happen gradually as a result. So what was the point of addressing any other expectations if the aim was to acculture those who are going to stay in the country and enculturate them with standard general public French television? And of course, at that time, the state had a monopoly on public broadcasting. In 1981, socialist president came to power, François Mitterrand, which marked a new phase of public policy and public media policy as regards immigration. The new government policy was initially characterized by basically a key principle, which was the right to be different, the right to be different. Alec Hargreaves called this multiculturalist policies, the French version of multiculturalist policies. And the key principle was that was social insertion. The insertion was the big buzzword used by the government. The idea being that minorities should be socially inserted in French society, but preserve their particularities, their cultural particularities. So there was this rhetoric of right to cultural difference, which is expressed, for instance, in a report drafted by Françoise Gaspard in 1982. She was a specialist in these questions, and at that time was mayor of Dreux. And in 1992, she published a report which is still worth reading to understand these issues. This report condemned the policies that have been conducted to date. It severely criticized how these people groups have been marginalized in major mainstream French media. She was very critical of the Mosaic program because she saw it as contributing to marginalization of these immigrant groups because they were ghettoized in television, as it were, whereas these, in fact, these people were no longer ghettoized. They were no longer immigrants. They were there. They were not there temporarily and then returning home. No, it was a different face of immigration. Immigrants who came, were installed in France, founded a family, and that needed that the French TV channels needed to properly take into consideration as a social reality. And she sent out a warning in 1982. She said that without a policy that recognized these minorities, the country ran the risk of unprecedented social explosion. So she wanted media recognition of these people groups, embodied in increased presence for all types of audience on public service broadcasting of these minorities. And remembering again that the state had a monopoly on broadcasting at that time. So the idea was to exhibit cultural differences to nurture mutual understanding. So this rhetoric of the right to cultural difference, which did not last very long, because this was the time when the Front National, far right, began to emerge and in fact won the mayoral seat of Dreux in an alliance with the right, and which quickly put the Socialist Party on the back foot and abandoned this rhetoric of the right to cultural difference and moved to a different key word, which was the word integration. And that becomes the new buzzword to understand government policy for both right and left-wing governments. We moved from this multiculturalism to integration. Integration opened up a new phase of public policy to it should have been accompanied by media policy for those who were immigrants or descendants of immigrants. The specific program Mosaic was one of the first victims of this integration policy, in the sense that it was taken off air in 1987 because it was suspected of nurturing cultural ghettos. That is what the Integration Council referred to in a subsequent report. So the another body that was involved at this time, a key body, in fact, supplying aid to state broadcasting, was the Social Action Fund, which changed its policy with respect to immigrant groups and ceased providing help for the production of specific programs, but instead helped programs that were directed at the general public. But the problem is that at the same time as the Social Action Fund was doing this, it also reduced aid to the general public channels. A report by the Panos Institute puts this quite well. It says that in the 1990s there was public policy in terms of broadcast presentation of ethnic minorities decreased after Mosaic was taken off air. Fewer minorities were seen on television. So then, in the 1990s, satellite dishes came along and illustrated the limits of the French public policy of the time, because all the work done on satellite TV with immigrant families shows that the success of these satellite dishes corresponds to a sense of not feeling recognized when watching standard public service broadcasting French TV. So, with these satellite dishes, concerns arose, major concerns as to the consequences of cultural dissociation that they could produce in French homes. There was a report put out by Leila Boechard, who worked for the French Audiovisual Council, illustrates these concerns. She says, for instance, that satellite dishes, satellite channels led to the risk of withdrawal of these communities, and therefore represent a danger for immigrant integration and strengthen propaganda of fundamentalist groups. This is in the 1990s. There was the civil war in Algeria, and there were terrorist attacks in France. So, in the wake of this resort, contractualization of certain channels was put in place with the French Audiovisual Council, but on the other hand, in some respects, the recommendations of this paper were not followed. For instance, nothing was done for public service broadcasting, and indeed, there have been changes there because there have been deregulation. There were no longer 3 public service broadcasters, but a whole bouquet of private channels. In the 1990s, there was no awareness of the significance of the use of television as a means of integration, even though that was official doctrine. And this awareness came at the end of the 1990s, with policies that will declare themselves to be diversity policies. But again, be careful. Diversity sounds very multicultural, but in fact the policies were not. They were in fact simply a continuation of historic integration policies implemented previously in the media. To explain why in the late 1990s and then into the 2000s this concern emerged, with the idea of implementing diversity, cultural diversity programs, a number of explanatory factors need to be taken into account. Firstly, there's the role of a number of non-profit bodies. For example, the role of the Égalité Collective, put together by Calixte Béala, and the role of the Averroès Club, led by Amirouche Laïdi. Hervé Bourges, who chaired the French Audiovisual Council at that time, recognized the importance of the Égalité Collective in particular. And that's quite surprising when you consider Hervé Bourges' career. This then was one of the first factors. A second factor is the increased awareness since the 1990s of the fact that discrimination of all kinds was a hindrance to social integration. A lot of research had been done into this by Alec Hargreaves. In the 1990s, there was a growing awareness of the detrimental effects of discrimination of different kinds against integration, and following on from this increased awareness of the negative role of discrimination, there was a positive awareness that misrepresentation in the media was also a form of discrimination, which took place in the media. So this wasn't so much new as that people became aware of it. Another major factor is the mobilization of some French think tanks, such as the Montaigne Institute, which combated discrimination in companies, and the media are, of course, also companies. So cultural diversity became an entrepreneurial value, and if you now visit the Montaigne Institute website, you can find out all about that. It says we should combat discrimination in a company. This is not about compassion, but about properly understood interests. In addition, in the last period, this recent period, there were the fears by the satellite bouquet from the Arab world in particular, which led people to one of the Audiovisual Council leaders thought there could be social disintegration instead of integration.
And so this fear will be materialized, will be come true, since the Almanar broadcasting channel was actually forbidden in 2004. So 2004, of course, comes in the aftermath of September the 11th, of course, international context, of course, led to some issues at a national level as well. So therefore, in this context, the diversity can be understood as a mean to divert the ethnic group from their homes, nations. Fourth point is the urban upheaval, the urban revolts, which took place in France in the end of 2005, and at the head of state, the president of the French Republic, Jacques Chirac, understood this and used the term media discrimination, and he said that some groups, some communities were suffering from media discrimination in the aftermath of those events, those urban upheavals. Law was passed and enforced so that broadcasting corporations work in order to promote and further social cohesion. So that was a key time, a turning point, really. We need to integrate diversity in the screens so that people can be integrated, inserted in society. But things will change dramatically in 2006. Since the field of application of diversity, we had used the term diversity until now so as to refer to the representation of the ethnic minorities, especially in the debates pertaining to the diversity and ethnic minorities in the media. But the CSA, the French regulating body, was requested to monitor not only the diversity of origins, but also not only diversity of origin and culture, but the CSA must be more active in promoting the diversity of the French society at large. So, in that document published by the CSA in 2006, the CSA reflects the fact that broadcasters and broadcasting companies must reflect all the components, all parts of the French society in terms of gender, age, social origin, ethnic minorities, sexual orientation, physical characteristics, disabilities, and so on. So therefore, this previous acceptation, understanding of diversity was extended to several factors. So therefore, it's more difficult to monitor. And that will be my last point to say. Therefore, that's one of the weaknesses and one of the limits of those diversity policies is the shift, the gap that exists between the great number of measures that were taken and the actual results. I do not have time to talk about all the actions that were implemented. First, in 2008, the Observatory of the Diversity was set up. And then the year after, there was a barometer to monitor diversity, also managed by the French regulatory body, the CSR. CSR must also provide an annual report pertaining to the progress of diversity in French media outlets, and therefore the idea was to monitor the progresses of diversity in French media outlets. The problem, as it was highlighted by some reports, there were lots of wills, lots of speeches, but very few practical actions, practical implementations. And Bernard Spitz provided a report pertaining to this in 2010, and he dealt especially with the TV broadcasting companies. The tools implemented by the CSR enables to limit those diversity policies. We can refer to the different barometers, monitoring tools of the CSR. You can see here the first column. That's the first diversity monitoring tool in 2009. You can see that the community considered as white represent 87%. And today, so according to the years, you can see there is a shift. We move from 84%. So there's no dramatic change. Things are pretty constant. And the managers of the French regulatory body recognize these facts, this reality. Other person in charge do acknowledge this reality as well. The members of the Observatory of Diversity have published, for instance, in June 2014, a column in the Journal du Dimanche in which they asked the managers of the broadcasting company to do more for diversity. Not taking into account this issue will lead the media systems to feed frustrations, and there will be a risk of upheaval, a social upheaval, and rebellions. So that echoes to some other publications and what was said previously. So that's it. That's pretty it, really. So why do these limits exist? Well, it's actually easier to launch injunctions to request changes from the top-down approach than fitting with the actual constraints requirements. So there is a big gap in those policies, something which is missing. That's the necessity to understand the structural constraints in which the media have to comply with and work with. So I was struck by the fact that at no time the structural constraints are not taken into taken into account. I'm not talking about financial or economical constraints. The power of balance within the editorial offices does not exist, but maybe that is the core of the problems, power of balance at the editorial level. And that's what we'll be looking at, studying during those 2 days. And thank you very much for listening to me.